Parts of a flower. A typical flower consists of four main parts. These are sepals, petals, stamens, and pistils. The stamens and pistil are the reproductive parts of a flower. A stamen has an anther which is supported by a long stalk called filament. The anther contains pollen grains. The pollen grain produces male gametes. So, pollen grains are the male reproductive unit of the flower. Pistil is the female reproductive part of the flower. Each pistil consists of a swallow-in stigma at the top, a long tube called the style, and a swollen ovary at the bottom. Ovary contains one or more ovules. The female gamete or the egg is formed in the ovule. There are two types of flowers, unisexual and bisexual. The unisexual flower is defined as the flower that possesses either stamen or pistils. They do not have both stamen and pistil. The example of few unisexual flowers are watermelon, papaya, cucumber, maize, pumpkin, etc. The bisexual flowers are those flowers which possess both stamen and pistil. Few examples of bisexual flowers are hibiscus, mustard, mango, rose, sunflower, etc. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of same or another flower. It is said to be the first process of fertilization in the flower. Pollen grains contain the male gamete are present in the anther of the flower. Generally, pollen grains have a tough protective coat which prevents them from drying up. Since pollen grains are light, they can be carried by wind or water. Insects like butterfly or honeybee visit flower and carry away pollen on their bodies. Some of the pollen lands on the stigma of a flower of the same kind. So this is how the pollination takes place in a flower. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. When the pollen is transferred from anther of a flower to the stigma of the same flower, it is called as self-pollination. This form of pollination is common in bisexual flower which contain both male and female reproductive part. In self-pollinating plant, there is less dependence on external factors to cause pollination. In the figure, it is shown how the pollen grain transfer from anther to the stigma of the same flower in case of self-pollination. Next is your cross-pollination. In this type of pollination, the pollen is transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. In the figure, you can see the pollen grain transfer from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of same kind. Cross-pollination is always dependent on another agent to cause transfer of pollen. That means the pollination depends on few external factors, and these factors are birds, insects, wind, water, etc. So this is how the pollination takes place in flower. Fertilization. The process of fusion of male and female gamete to form a zygote is called fertilization. Fertilization takes place after pollination and germination. So how the fertilization takes place? In the process of pollination, the pollen grain is transferred from anther to the stigma. So first the pollen grain land on stigma. Next, the pollen grain germinate. That germinated pollen grain enter into the ovary through pollen tube. Inside the ovary, the pollen tube contain the male gamete. So inside the ovary, the male gamete fuse with the female gamete, that is ovule, and this fusion of male and the female gamete is called fertilization. And when the fertilization takes place, it forms a new cell that is called as zygote, and this is a single cell. The zygote divides continuously, it undergoes continuous cell division, and it ultimately develops into embryo.